After shooting with the S1H for the weekend, because it is a rental, I only had it for a few days, I've talked about the footage, I've talked about my initial kind of nitpicks and gripes about the handling, the ergonomics, the things that caught me off guard, but I wanted to take some time to talk through the photography components of the camera as well, because it is a hybrid and it should be able to take photos. At least it should be able to do it well if you're gonna buy a camera like this. The S1H is definitely a video camera first. It's a filmmaker's camera, in fact. You can shoot beautiful cinema with this. I'm pretty positive if you put this in the right hands, skilled hands, you'll get amazing, beautiful footage every single time because it's a lovely video camera to work with. But how is it as a photo cam? Well, let's start looking at some images because I wanted to compare it to the GH5, which I've been shooting with for quite a while now, and also a great video photo hybrid. So if you have a GH5, like I do, and that's where I'm coming from, this perspective, what's the difference? Is it meaningful? Is it, does it matter to you? That's at least what I wanted to talk about because the S1H is more expensive, it's newer, and so for all intents and purposes, it should be better. That's not what this conversation is about. It is a better camera. I'll tell you that right off the bat. The S1H is better than the GH5, hands down. It should be. It's more expensive and it's newer. The question is how much better and if that difference is meaningful to you. Is it worth the extra couple $1,000s that it's going to cost you to upgrade from one to the other? And then potentially in all the lenses as well, that'll be expensive too. So let's look at the images and see kind of if we can kind of nail this down and distinguish between where do we find value. So the first thing I want to show you is that this is what the raw images look like when you bring them into your computer. And it doesn't look like I did my job very well. It looks like it is severely underexposed. However, this is not always the case. The JPEGs are totally fine. It is just the raw photos come in really, really dark. Am I the only one that's encountered this? No. In fact, if you pop over and you do a quick Google search, you can see that there are a couple people, although I haven't seen many people talking about this, that the S1H dark raw images, and there's some questions back and forth of like, is it this certain setting? And I don't really know what the issue is. Someone else posted on DP Review that this is just bizarre and kind of weird. It could be an Adobe bug, just the way it interprets the raw data. That's always a risk you run with having raw camera data. It's that it's kind of unique and the software side needs to support it all, but just something to keep in mind. However, it doesn't actually affect the images all that much. They're totally fine. It's just they come in really dark. It looks like you underexposed it by 3 stops. In fact, when you bump up the exposure by 3 stops, you get what you actually shot. This is my son Clark. He was my helpful model over the weekend as we were just shooting pictures around the house. Obviously, he's a happy guy, and then he can also be kind of an angry guy certain times, depending on his mood. This is the S1H, and one of these photos is from the S1H, and one of them is from the GH5. I'll give you a second to kind of take your guess as to which one is which. Now, I should mention, this isn't a pure, scientific test. I'm just kind of taking pictures candidly around the house, slightly different focal lengths, slightly different timings, right? I'm not taking photos simultaneously somehow with both my hands being everything perfect. I'm just kind of taking photos with the S1H and then also taking them with the GH5. Now, if you wanted to take a guess and you guessed that the S1H is on the left, you'd be correct. The left is the S1H and the right is the GH5. Are they perfectly matching in terms of my color grading and stuff in Lightroom? No, they're not. I basically applied the same settings and then tweaked them to get close. You could do a much better job of fine-tuning the differences between the S1H and the GH5 in terms of color and look and feel. But I just wanted to do this as kind of a fun experiment of if you were just shooting, would you notice anything meaningful? Now, again, I do want to point out, I'm shooting this with the S1H with the 24-70, the Pro Lumix full frame lens, it's L mount. And then on the GH5, I'm using this really cheap Yongnuo, it's a 42.5, it's basically an 85mm equivalent. I did that so that I could match sort of depth of field and focal length between these two cameras. This is just a really cheap, easy lens to throw on the camera. If anything happens to it, you're not going to freak out and worry about it. I have more expensive 85s, but they're like cinema lenses. They're the Zine lenses for photography. This is the one I have for micro four thirds because I don't actually invest in a lot of micro four thirds lenses. oddly enough, even having a GH5, because I never wanted to get stuck in the micro four thirds system. I like Super 35, I like full frame, so I don't really tend to buy a lot of expensive lenses for smaller sensor sizes. If I'm going to buy an expensive lens, it'll probably be something like an EF mount, or we'll see what happens in the future. But for photography and having something that can do autofocus, that's what I'm using. It's not the greatest lens, but it's a fun little lens, and it's really cheap and really affordable. And you can check it out if you want. It's the Yongnuo 42.5mm lens. So I'm trying to match depth of field and exposure here, and you can see that shot here, how they kind of look. Now, what's more interesting is when we zoom in, again, understanding that these are two different lenses. So this is the S1H, very sharp, very clear, nice image. And I'm using the eye face auto detection, and the S1H for photography, it works really, really well. I can't say it works just as well as a Sony or Canon, but for all of my shooting, I didn't have any issues with the autofocus, not getting it consistently. There'd be a few shots here or there where a shot would be out of focus due to the face eye detect, but in general, it was always spot on. Whereas over on the GH5 side of the frame, you can see it's a little bit noisier, it's a little bit lower resolution in terms of detail, and just in general, it's not quite as sharp or as nice as the S1H. But the S1H is a 24 megapixel camera, the GH5 is a 20 megapixel camera, depending on the aspect ratio you're using there, but also using the face eye detect on the GH5, because that also has it as well. So you can kind of do face eye detect for this type of stuff when your kids are just running around and you're just trying to grab photos on the fly. Let's move on to the next set of images here. There's another pairing of images between the S1H. The S1H from now on is just always on the left, and the GH5 is always on the right. And I'm gonna pop over here real quick and just say that the GH5 being micro four third and the S1H being full frame, obvious differences there. Doing my best to show that hopefully by the time we get through this, the actual difference between the two. So if we pop back here, we can see that image, and then moving on, here's another little, so I brought the light over, a big just, softbox light, so I had some kind of source there, but this is not high-end photography by any means. It's just taking pictures around the house. You can see again on the left, the S1H, on the right, the GH5, and really hopefully what I wanted to paint a picture with this is when you're looking at it certain sizes, let's say it's Instagram or it's on a website or you're just glancing at a photo, you're not probably going to really be able to tell the difference between the GH5 and the S1H, given that the S1H, the kit that I'm using right now is like $6,000 worth of gear, and the GH5 is maybe $1,500, with this lens, and then the body now is significantly cheaper than when it came out. So it's only when you really zoom in and you go into the details here that you start to see how much more detail and resolution there is on the S1H. For a 24-70, I'm actually pretty impressed with how sharp and detailed the Panasonic lens is. Typically, those zooms sometimes can suffer a little bit from just resolution and lack of sharpness. It's definitely not as much there with the Yongnuo 42.5. And this shot is actually probably slightly out of focus on the eyes. It looks like the focal plane's a little bit back by the ears. And that's the risk you run with using the kind of what I would say the older autofocus on the GH5 compared to the S1H. The S1H seemed to do a better job always getting the eyes in focus. With the GH5 was a little bit more of like close, but not quite always exactly there. And I am shooting basically wide open on that lens, the Yongnuo, so it's like 1.7, super shallow depth of field, not as shallow as that would be on full frame. The full frame is at 2.8, so I'm trying to match those as close as possible. Moving right along to the next set. So here's some more. You can see the shirt color. I actually think the colors basically with my kind of standard quick color edits I did in Lightroom, the GH5 is a little bit more of like the natural color of the shirt. It's more of that red rather than the S1H in that kind of burnt orange color. It's really, that's so subjective though, and that's why I don't really want to like nitpick the color too much, because it's photography. You can always change it to your heart's desire. The sky's the limit in terms of the amount of photo manipulation you want to do. I'm not doing any, clone stamping or airbrushing or any, dodging and burning on any of this stuff. Just straight out of camera with like some basic slider adjustments in Lightroom. Here's outside, and you can see S1H on the left, GH5 on the right. Very, very similar at a glance. You might be able to nitpick and say, oh, this, oh, that, oh, the depth of field, or oh, the bokeh, but like a lot of that's down to the lens. You can get shallow depth of field on the GH5 just like you can on a full frame camera. The difference comes in when you zoom into these images and you see them really, really up close, and you start to see how much detail is actually there on the S1H and how much you can zoom into that 24 megapixel image and still have really, really nice sharpness and detail, whereas on the GH5, not quite there. And again, it looks like it missed that autofocus a little bit past the eyes. You can do a better job of that if you're not using the auto tracking, but I think nowadays people are kind of looking for that feature to be fairly rock solid. Thankfully, the S1H was performing where the GH5 was underperforming in that regard. But if you're scaling these down for social media, you know, just as like some images, family photo type things, GH5 does a pretty good job of matching the S1H. Here's another picture. Had to give the little guy a popsicle because he was doing a great job being a model for these photos. So he got a little treat there. And again, you can see on the right with the GH5, you can see the kind of barrel distortion, and the bokeh is not quite as pleasing. Again, that's the lens I'm using. The S1H on the left, a little bit wider field of view because I'm basically in the same spot. I'm shooting at 70 millimeters with that S1H, and on the GH5, it's like basically like an 85 millimeter equivalent. So you can kind of see it's a little bit wider field of view, but of course you could adjust that just by moving, you know, slightly the differences between the two cameras. And again, in terms of like color, dynamic range, all that stuff, looking pretty similar. You can at least make the two mimic each other fairly well. Here's one that I kind of like how this photo turned out. S1H on the left, GH5 on the right, as always. And if we zoom in here, we can kind of see the one on the right, the autofocus nailed on the GH5, that nailed the eyes, which is what you would want. But you can get real close in here on the S1H. So this is the S1H, really detailed, lots of resolution. Over on the GH5, we've got similar, but hopefully you can tell, even with the slightly closer composition, it's still quite not as sharp. But in all honesty, that could be down to the lens in this given situation. So it's a little bit noisier, a little bit more kind of noise texture here on the image in the background compared to the S1H. A little bit cleaner, still has some of that kind of noise compression artifacts, but it's just a little bit more of that texture with the GH5, which is kind of normal. I've come to expect that. And we're really zoomed in here. You know, this is a nice shot. I'd be happy to print either of these out and maybe frame it, put it on the wall. As fun memory of the time Dad gave him a popsicle for taking some pictures. I like how this image turned out as well. The S1H is definitely a better expression on the left than on the right. It's not always easy to get a 2-year-old to cooperate with the smiling, but Clark's doing a pretty good job, and I appreciate him helping out. Again, we zoom in here using just the autofocus eye tracking in the S1H. Beautiful, beautiful detail here. I mean, you can get right up in there, and it's just spectacular, the detail and the quality of this camera. GH5, it's there, just not quite the same detail there. But again, you invest in a nicer lens, probably it's going to maybe cover that gap, cover that distance, because again, I'm shooting with a really cheap lens here on the GH5. So that's how close you can get, you know, between the expensive full frame camera and the cheapy GH5 with the cheapo Yongnuo lens. And for the most part, I think a lot of people aren't really going to be able to tell the difference. You can go in there, you can sharpen it with some brushes, do a little bit extra Photoshop, cover all that difference. And here's another shot, S1H on the left, GH5 on the right. This, I'm pretty sure I did stay in the exact same spot as much as possible, so that's the actual focal length difference between 70 and 85, or 85 equivalent rather on the GH5. So you can see kind of how that turned out. And we can zoom in one last time because we're getting towards the end of these. Again, color is not something that I spent a lot of time on with these and making these perfect, because it's very, very subjective. And you know, if I was going to pick one of these images to print, I might go in here and do some more photoshopping, clear up some of the crumbs, maybe just make it a little bit nicer. But in general, the S1H is looking great with that 24-70 zoom lens, and then the GH5 also looking really nice. Just slightly less detail there, but to be expected considering the price. And I think for the most part, the differences are pretty negligible. However, I will say fighting with the autofocus on the GH5 and just going through the photos and having them just be slightly out of focus consistently with the GH5 and the tracking there and how it was taking those shots, I definitely preferred the S1H's ability to get focus every single time. However, there was one final shot when I was going through where the S1H did miss it. So I didn't want to just show like the S1H is like, it always got it. It was always perfect. There was this one where Clark was just kind of sitting there and it did that kind of Panasonic looking for the focus, and there was a shot fired in between there where it missed focus on the eyes. So it's not perfect every single time, but definitely more often than not, the vast majority of the time, things were in focus and looking good the way you would want. And again, you can spend as much time on set as you want getting it perfectly in focus when it matters. This is just me running around the house in the backyard, taking some candid photos, which is how a lot of people shoot as well. So I want to make sure the camera, like, put it through the regular everyday use, because I know I as a professional can always make it better. It's just kind of what's the baseline? What am I working with out of the box? I'm gonna pop over to the chat because that's the end of the photos for now. Nothing going on there. So hopefully that was helpful and you got to see the comparison between the S1H and the GH5. They are different cameras. One's significantly more expensive. However, the GH5, even with a really cheap, you know, I think this lens like is $100. Let's look it up. Let's look up and see how much this lens is. It's not that expensive at all. It does a great job. You know, the GH5 can take great photos, shallow depth of field, all the things. You know, it's not like you have to have the full frame to get certain looks. You do, but you can match them as well. It's just really what your budget is and what you're looking for and how much detail and resolution you actually need. I definitely prefer the images from the S1H, but the question of is it worth it? I think for professional work, absolutely. If someone's, you know, a client's paying you to take photos, they should be the highest quality possible. In which case, look for something that's going to take really, really nice photos, which the S1H is going to do that, as well as there's many other cameras that will do that. What about the cheaper alternatives? I think that's more for like personal use, friends, family, that kind of thing, where you're just on vacation and they want good images because you're a photographer, you do video. You can have something that's a little bit cheaper, and that way you can bring it with you and not worried about bringing your whole kit and then it gets lost or it gets stolen or it gets trashed. There's a lot of things that can go wrong when you bring everything with you everywhere, and so I kind of like to have that, like the cheap stuff that I bring with me on just casual stuff, and then the more expensive stuff that I bring on jobs where it counts. So this is the, you know, Yongnuo 42.5 f1.7 micro four thirds lens, $100. I think it's totally worth $100. There's definitely better, you know, 85mm equivalents out there, but just as something to throw in your bag, just to have with you as you go out and about. And if you're just going to put the images on Instagram, it'll definitely do a better job than, you know, your iPhone in portrait mode or something like that. And that's kind of how typically I like to do that type of work, where it is like what I was showing, the kind of candid stuff. It's typically the friends and family who just want you to take nice pictures of them, but they're not pixel peeping. They're not zooming in to 400% and going, oh, this is, you know, looks awful. Like, what'd you do? Because they're just going to post it to Instagram, and they just want something that looks nice. So it's like whatever's kind of cheapest, quickest, easiest. The fact that like on both of these cameras, you have the Wi-Fi modes, which you have on a lot of cameras nowadays. You just send it right to your phone, text it over after you do a few edits if you need or you want to. And then people have like this great photo that really was pretty easy to put together, rather than having like all the big bulky heavy stuff that you have to bring with you everywhere and, you know, make a whole ordeal out of it. It's like you can get by with a GH5 for that kind of stuff. So hopefully that helps paint the picture between the S1H and the GH5 in terms of photography. You could always go up from there and make it better and better and better by obviously doing more intentional shoots with better lighting and paying more attention to the autofocus. But in general, I'm very, very happy with how the S1H performed, especially with the 24-70 lens. I was kind of expecting it to maybe be a little underwhelming, but definitely looks great. And if I was gonna buy the S1H, I probably would opt for some kind of prime as my kind of main go-to, probably an 85mm prime, just for that extra sharpness there, because you're just typically going to happen. The primes are going to be sharper than the zooms, but the zooms are really versatile and you can take them, kind of do a little bit of everything. So it depends on what you need to do. If it was me and I was going to get the S1H, I'd probably get a prime with it, but for the rental, I at least wanted the 24-70 just for maximum versatility, and I could get a wide variety of both footage and photos. Will I be making the purchase of the S1H? I still don't know. I think I have to marinate on it for quite a while. This definitely seems like a good year to upgrade your cameras, whether it's the S1H, the A7S III. If you want to go to Canon or get a Canon with the R5 and R6 overheating issues, that's not for me. But you know, if you want to go the cinema route and get a Z-Cam or a Blackmagic, what's cool is that there's so much great new stuff coming out, and it's not stopping there. There's more stuff coming as well. The GH5 is getting pretty old. You know, a GH6 should be right around the corner. I expect there's probably some delays there in terms of manufacturing for obvious reasons, but I don't think we'll have to wait too long to see a GH6 announced or maybe even released, because it's time. It's time for that camera, and then a follow-up to the S1 should be maybe next year. Hopefully, fingers crossed, they can come out with an S2, kind of a quick follow-up to improve upon the system and make it more approachable for newcomers like myself, who I don't have any L-mount glass. This is the first L-mount camera I've ever shot with, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm kind of sad to have to send it back. Being a rental, I kind of maybe want to keep it, but also don't know that I exactly want to spend that much money on a camera right now. I think I'm gonna wait it out a little bit, see how things go, because I don't actually need a new camera right now. I just kind of want one because everyone's talking about new cameras, and it's that time to like, well, this year I'm probably gonna get something. It's just a matter of like, what is it and what the right choice is. I definitely want to go something with a mirrorless mount, whether that's L mount, E mount, we'll see. I don't know, maybe it'll be Micro Four Third again if the GH6 shows something, you know, incredibly promising, but only time will tell. I'm not in any rush, and I don't think you should be either. Don't feel like you have to buy the newest thing just because it's new. Spend some time, make sure you do all the research, rent these cameras, try before you buy, see what you like, see what works for you, and go from there. It's the best thing. Try before you buy. Don't just go do the pre-order because the spec sheet sounds great. Make sure you know what you're signing up for. Because ideally these cameras should last you a while. You know, the GH5 has lasted me, like I said, what's it been, 3 or 4 years? And I've done a lot with it. And that's, I mean, easy investment up front because it's so cheap. The more expensive the camera, the harder it is to justify that cost over a longer period of time. Because you know by the time, like let's say you bought a $50,000 camera and you're going to pay it off over, you know, or it's going to make its money back and work over the next maybe 5 years or something like that. Well, in 5 years, maybe even in 2 years or 3 years, you could get those same features for $5,000. Now you're on the hook for $50,000 over 5 years, and someone else was able to get basically the exact same camera for $5,000. This happens time and time again. Even though the newest stuff comes out and it seems great and it seems amazing, stuff keeps getting better all the time, and you definitely will have that buyer's remorse if you spend too much on something that you're not quite ready for. So if you're on the fence and you're not sure and you're thinking, oh, well, I could justify it if I get it, and then I get these, if I get the camera, then I'll get this type of work. And no, don't do that kind of mental gymnastics. Get the camera you need for the jobs you already have. And if you're not getting the type of work that, you know, require something higher end, then you need to ask yourself, like, why? Like, what could you be doing better with what you already have that would justify people paying you to do it more high end, more premium? And that's just something that comes with time. It's experience. It's being a good business person, you know, selling yourself, selling your brand, getting jobs, finding clients, that whole deal. It depends on the nature of your business and what you do, which is why there isn't like a one size fits all prescription, because it's a little bit different for everybody. Is it weddings? Is it corporate videos? Is it filmmaking? Is it YouTube? There's a variety of ways to generate, you know, income from video, from photo, from creative type work, but it's hard to justify some really expensive purchases, and so it makes sense why a lot of people love, you know, the GH4, GH5, because they make the powerful features so accessible because it's such a low price point. Whereas you start looking at an S1H and you go, ooh, that's a little bit more expensive. I don't know. Can I justify that? And then, you know, even beyond that, it just goes up from there to high end type stuff. And that turns a lot of people off, but it has the cool factor because it's expensive. Same thing happens with cars or homes or any other, you know, luxury thing. And it's like, it's funny to talk about them like that because a lot of these things, people drive nice cars, luxury vehicles just for the luxury of it. But when you're talking about tools to do your job, that certain features you don't have access to, like for a while it's been RAW. But even you look at it now, and now RAW is becoming more and more ubiquitous, but it's still very hard to get into because of the costs associated with the hard drives and just the workflow. So you might think you want something or need a special feature and then realize once you have it, you don't hardly ever use it. So you really, that's why, rent the cameras, evaluate them, see what you need, see what you don't need, test them out, and kind of go from there so you can make a good judgment based on hopefully doing a lot of research and an understanding of what the camera can do, but then also applying your own kind of hands-on experience with it. I think is a great way to go about it. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there unless there's something else that you guys want to talk about in the chat, but I think that's all I really had to talk about. I've really enjoyed the time with the S1H. It's been a fun camera to use, to play around with, to shoot a few test shots here and there. I did use it for a project, something I can't show the footage for, but hopefully in my other video where I talk about reviewing that footage, I was trying to give at least some kind of semblance of decent quality test footage. It's nothing spectacular, but you can go test that out. That's all, you can go watch that. It's on the channel. Me reviewing the footage in the same way that I went through the photos, but a little bit clunkier because I'm in Premiere and it was bogging down the computer. The photos, it's so easy. It's what a breeze to just review JPEGs. How nice. Whereas, you know, Premiere editing 4K 10-bit footage it can chug, especially when you're doing a live stream. And then just my initial impressions. I think I kind of point out a lot of stuff that maybe some people I haven't seen covered. It's very nitpicky. It's nothing I would hold against the camera long term of like a reason not to buy it. It's just odd little quirks. The things that you inevitably experience when you use a camera for the first time of, well, why does it work that way? Or, oh, that's kind of odd. Or, oh, this is strange. That kind of stuff, that immediate shock reaction, I think is valuable because then you can immediately, if you have that same experience, if you know that going in, you can move by it and get to the fun part, which is shooting and capturing footage and taking photos and whatnot. Again, I don't know if the S1H is right for me, but I am sad to see it go. I wish I could just kind of hang on to it indefinitely, but that would be cost prohibitive. It wouldn't make sense to just keep spending more money on a rental. It's got to go at this point. Got to go back. I would love to keep using it on more work because the footage does look very, very good. It's beautiful. The footage is great. The dynamic range, resolution, everything is spot on, especially compared to the GH5, and rightfully so. Again, it's a more expensive camera. It should be better, but I really do like how the footage looks from the S1H, and I'm going to be missing it, you know, when I'm shooting stuff with the GH5, thinking, wow, if I shot with the S1H, it would look better. But it's per project of like when it makes sense, when you can justify the extra cost, and, you know, already having the Ursa Mini Pro, it's like already kind of have that in certain ways. I do definitely like the S1H. Well, I can't say that. I like the S1H in the same way that I like the GH5 for shoots where it's like hybrid style shooting, more kind of run and gun, do a lot, you know, taking photos, taking video, bouncing back and forth, where the Ursa Mini is still kind of run and gun, but much more in that kind of cinematic style of shooting, which you can still do with the S1H. It's just, do you want the camera on your shoulder or do you want to hold it in your hands? And that's not even true because the Ursa Mini I do hold down low if I have a wide angle lens on it. but it's bigger, it's bulkier, it's a lot more to carry. So sometimes you just don't feel like doing that depending on the project. If it's not something super high end, having something you're just like, yep, let's film, let's go. And it's just like really small, easy, tight, compact. That's where I see the benefit of the S1H. It's like the step up from the GH5. It truly is. If you have a GH5 and you're looking for better quality and you love everything the GH5 does and you just want more of it, the S1H is an obvious choice. Lots more coming though. Plenty of new cameras coming out. And really, I don't think there's an easy way just to make a recommendation for everyone, because everyone is different. It's really such a personal, individual choice. You have to figure out what makes the most sense for you. And right now, if the cost wasn't associated with it, like, yes, absolutely, I'd take the S1H in a heartbeat, because I would stop shooting with the GH5 and I'd go straight to the S1H. But the fact that there's the cost there and there's more newer cameras coming, I don't know, still on the fence. So that's all I have to say about that. I will talk to y'all later.